Welcome to Zain Khan Live, where everything is discussed and nothing is censored. Today we have with us a scientist, a paleontologist, and also a very popular intelligent design proponent, Gunter Bechly from Vienna. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Gunter.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
We have with us from Canada a scholar, a philosopher, a researcher, Matthew Ehret. He writes on geopolitics and also social issues. Welcome to our show, Matthew. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for having me back on.
Now, Matthew, let's start with the documentary of Ben Steen. It's a very it was out in 2008. It's been some time, but let's talk a little more about it. What could you understand? What did you extract from the documentary? What did you understand by, like, for me, what I understood by the documentary was that even in science, there is elite academics, and if you don't agree with their worldview, you get isolated. And that's how Ben Steen, interviewed a few scientists who did not agree with Darwin's theory or biological evolution, and they were actually fired from their jobs, and they were being isolated, and they were losing their jobs. So I don't know. That's what I understood from the documentary. How did you see it?
That documentary, No Intelligence Allowed, was really an eye-opener for me as somebody who doesn't have a thorough, I mean, I didn't have a saturated scientific background, but as somebody who was more engaged in political activities, working with political organizations, I was trying to make sense of our history. How did we get here? How do these problems, how were they generated? And watching that documentary was a great entry point to expand my understanding of the higher problems of the mind and the false schisms, the false polarizations that were created a long time before I was even born, regarding how either one has to be considered a creationist who believes in a literal interpretation of the Bible and tries to explain all of nature from that, or they have to be a radical absolute Darwinist, and there's nothing in between. And that documentary really clearly got across that you don't have to take one pole or another, but rather the truth resides somewhere both in between and above that polarization when you look at the directionality in nature and the evidence of design, which is just so eloquently expressed in that video.
Now, what you just mentioned, that you either have to believe in a literal, interpretation of the Bible or any other religious book, or you have to literally blindly believe in Darwin. Isn't that like another form of blind belief, in your opinion, Matthew?
Oh, most certainly. I think anytime you believe in an idea, content, some thing that explains everything absolutely about anything, if you just believe it without having discovered why that's true for yourself, but simply rely on the consensus view of experts as a substitute for your own personal thought and investigation, immediately that becomes, I think, essentially a blind religious faith. It's no longer something that's associated with real knowledge. So I think that, yeah, even though many people might consider themselves even atheists who reject any evidence of design or theism, they might qualify, I think, with my idea as being religious, religious in their own way.
Maybe dogmatic is the right word.
Dogmatic might be it, but I would say they're religiously anti-God. They don't, and they believe it blindly.
Let's get to Dr. Gunter. I mean, he was part of the Discovery Institute. He's popular. Many people know his story, but I want him to tell us his story in our show. Dr. Gunter, tell us a little more about how you were before you joined the Discovery Institute and your journey, because we all know that you say that you were a diehard Darwinist, as you might call it now. Tell us a little more about your journey.
Sure. So I'm a paleontologist. I studied at the University of Tübingen and then made a PhD there on fossil insects, and then worked for 17 years at the Natural History Museum in Stuttgart. That's in southern Germany and is one of the 5 biggest natural history museums in Germany. And for 17 years, I was there a scientific curator for amber and fossil insects in the paleontology department. And never doubted Darwin or even thought about this. That was for me a no-brainer. Of course, Darwinism is true. And of course, evolution in this sense happened. And like it was just said, I also associated most critics of Darwinism with some religious motivation and thought they are Bible motivated creationists and so on. And in 2009, there was a double centennial. There was celebrating the 200th birthday of Charles Darwin and the 150th anniversary of the first publication of his magnum opus of The Origin of Species. And for this event, which was called the Darwin Year, there were certain events planned to celebrate this. And at our museum, we planned a large exhibition called Der Fluss des Lebens, the stream of life or the river of life. And I was responsible for the organization of this exhibition, the scientific organization, but also the administrative part to organize this whole event, which later turned out to be the biggest Darwin Year celebration event in Germany overall. And for this event, for this Darwin exhibition, we planned different subjects, of course, explaining the theory, but also discussing potential critics. And therefore, I researched this issue of intelligent design and creationism, and we planned several modules in the exhibition to illustrate this. And I had planned for this exhibition one thing to make this more, let's say, visual. And I planned a kind of medieval wooden balance. And on this wooden balance, I wanted to put the books of the critics on one side, a large pile of books by creationists and intelligent design proponents and other Darwin critics. And on the other side of the balance, just the main opus of Darwin. And the balance should go down on the side of Darwin to show all the other stuff is irrelevant and lightweighted nonsense. So to have this exhibition item, I had to buy a lot of these books via Amazon, and I had piled them up in my office. And in the preparation for the exhibition, I then thought, maybe I have a look at these books. There could be discussions or questions by visitors of the exhibition. So let's have a look to be prepared to give good answers to these silly questions. And I looked into the books. There were some that met my expectations, some especially young earth creationist works where I thought, well, that's what I expected. And then I looked into the books of the intelligent design movement, and what I found there were totally scientific arguments, no arguments from the Bible or from religion, merely scientific and mathematical arguments, some philosophical, epistemological issues. And so I thought, well, these arguments are not exactly what I expected, but there should be answers. And I thought, well, as a trained and PhD biologist, I should know the answers. And for most of the questions, I didn't know answers, so I researched further. And the more I researched, the more I became convinced that there is something to these problems, and that these are valid questions and valid problems that show that there are limits to the theory. And so I became more and more first a skeptic and then a Darwin critic myself, but I didn't tell anybody because, of course, I was also afraid of career consequences and risks. And I also watched the movie Expelled during this time, but I thought, well, that's America. In America, this is very tense. Probably in Europe, this is more relaxed and people don't react so harsh. And in 2015, then I decided to become more public, more outspoken about my position, which was criticizing the Darwinian mechanism, not common ancestry or the age of the earth, but the question, can this mechanism really sufficiently explain the diversity and complexity of life? And then I had to find out that it was like in Expelled. So after several weeks only of my coming out as an ID proponent, the reaction came in, and colleagues started to talk behind my back. Have you heard? Bechly has become a creationist, and how can we help him? So they talked as if I have gone mad or fallen into the brainwashing of some cult. And then they refused to further collaborate with me. Suddenly, there were enormous administrative obstacles to get new material or to get approvals for research trips or to get grant money, which never happened before. And this escalated over the following months.
So there were career consequences. Career consequences.
Definitely. It was actually after half a year, there was no productive work anymore possible. My website, which was purely scientific, had nothing to do with intelligent design, was purely about dragonflies and fossil insects, was deleted from the museum server. And I was in charge for another exhibition, which should be an exhibition about the amber forest. And I was the curator for amber. So the main position at the museum who had the expertise to do this. It was my idea to do this exhibition. And then I was called to the director, and she told me, well, with this exhibition, you will be also in the media presence, and there will be TV and radio interviews. We don't want you to have this exposed position. We will take this leadership of the exhibition away from you, and you have to do the footwork, and somebody else will stay in front and will be the official leader of this exhibition, which also happened. So this just some examples what happened, and which showed me, well, there's no future at this museum. I can't do work anymore. I can't do cooperations. I don't get fossils to study anymore because the money is refused. And so in the end of the year 2016, we agreed that I leave the museum more or less voluntarily. You can think for yourself how much voluntary this was. And then I had to look for something else. And as it turned out, I found a new place for doing research, and where I could say what I want and think what I want, and also do the research that interests me, and that it was at Discovery Institute. And there I'm now doing research on the relationship between the fossil record and the question of Darwinism, intelligent design.
Great.
Yeah, that's my story. Yeah.
Great.
Matthew, from Dr. Gunter's story, where he said that he started thinking and rethinking his opinion, but then he just couldn't come out. And why couldn't he come out? He was afraid of the obviously career consequences. And it's not just career consequences. There's so many other consequences that are actually aligned with career consequences. So, I'm thinking in my mind while Dr. Gunter was speaking, why is it so hard? I mean, you're either from the left or you're from the right. If you think out of the box, there's consequences. And, there are some times when even you and me have some opinions and we don't want to talk about it in public because, oh my God, well, what are people going to say about it? People are going to have their opinions about us.
Yeah, will be censored from social media or YouTube or
Why is that so? Why aren't intellectuals and scholars and scientists and philosophers free to properly think and rethink their opinions? Because that way they can actually innovate in a better way. They can move forward.
Oh, that's such a good question. It's such a, I think without going into this ad infinitum or ad nauseum, I think that one of the key problems is the lack of understanding of the nature of the mind of humankind. Because I mean, if there's many things that we find similar in the human organism to other species that are there in nature on a material level. The DNA is not that different from other forms of monkeys. But what we find distinguishes our species as a character over the course of thousands of years is the fact that, unlike other species, our populations not only grow quantitatively, apparently always overcoming our carrying capacities when our civilization doesn't collapse into empire and then we have a dark age. But whenever we're able to overcome these limits to our existence, it's through this leaping out of the logical domain of just description into eurekas. We make discoveries and we discover new principles that organize nature, and we apply them in the form of new technologies. We find new things that are resources that we didn't think were resources, that all of a sudden give, again, like I said, it's not just a quantitative, but also qualitative growth of our species. So we can sustain more people with a higher quality of life, higher living standards, and more access to our cognitive potential when we're not just beasts of the field, like sort of just physically laboring, as our ancestors had to do just to make material existence happen. So this happens because, yes, we have this faculty of logic, which is great, and we have our senses, but it's not through simply deductive or inductive reasoning, not simply reasoning that starts with imagined laws that we use to guide our understanding of nature, or simply just extrapolating patterns we see from our senses in nature and calling it a law. It's not just simply one of those two or some combination alone that allows for these eurekas to happen. There's something of an additional leap of creative insight that is very important, and really everybody can do this, So I think that there has been, I think, a mystification, maybe for political motives, perhaps, of this nature of mind over time, so that people don't realize that when we have an idea that animals don't have, we can create a goal, an intention for the future, maybe even an impossible one, and carry out and shape our existence to unfold according to that future state we want to attain. And that is where people say, oh, that's conspiracy theories. If you try to look for that in history and what organizes human history, you're a conspiracy theorist because you believe in intention, and intentions are metaphysical. They're invisible. They're not. So you're crazy. But
I just wanted to add.
That sort of gets at it. Sorry.
I wanted to add this, and this is a question for Matthew and also Dr. Gunter, and I would like Matthew to go first and Dr. Gunter to go second. Isn't mainstreaming intellectualism the same as what happened to Tesla? I mean, when Tesla came out, he wasn't mainstream, and he was sidelined. And even Galileo. I mean, mind you, I know Galileo was persecuted by religious people, right? But that was Galileo, right?
He was persecuted, yeah.
Yeah.
You're asking me?
I mean, isn't that like the same thing as what's happening right now when you start demonifying intellectual scientists, philosophers? If they're thinking out of the mainstream, you're like, oh no, you either choose the left or the right, or we're not going to accept you. You're going to lose your job.
Max Planck once said that when you make a new idea, when you bring a new idea into the human zeitgeist, that it's more likely the case that you're not going to convince the old generation of establishment scientists that you're right. You're going to have to wait usually until they die off, and the next generation is going to be the one to realize and adopt that higher truth. And I think that always sort of the schism we get, between the bread-fed scholar like Friedrich Schiller once called it, you have a choice as a student going into science or anything of either becoming a bread-fed scholar, the Brotgelehrten, the scholar who builds their career for bread and for money and for fame and security, or you have the philosopher, the person who really loves truth. And you have a choice to make, and people often make the wrong choice.
I'd like Dr. Gunter to answer this about mainstreaming intellectualism and intellectuals. And also, I want him to tell us a little more about the Discovery Institute and his experience there.
Right. So concerning mainstreaming, I think there's one point that also happened to me when I was studying at university. I thought, well, science is some wonderful enterprise where everybody is just searching for truth and the scientific community is together looking to improve humanity and so on. But of course, after some years, you find out that in reality, often the question, especially when you have these mainstream paradigms, is also about grant money, about getting the positions, about fame. And so there are very social human issues playing a role that have nothing to do with scientific question and scientific truth. And I totally realized this also during the preparations for these exhibitions. We had this kind of accompanying program, and there was a radio debate, and there were mainstream Darwinists. There was one guy called Thomas Juncker, which is the kind of German Darwin's bulldog, kind of German Richard Dawkins. And then there was a guy who was a complete atheist and naturalist, but he wrote a book called The Cooperative Gene as a kind of critique of Dawkins' book. And he criticized the mainstream Darwinian picture, but from a totally materialist point of view. But even he was attacked and was his credentials were denied and so on. So you could see, as soon as you attack a mainstream paradigm, you are considered as a threat, because there are all these things playing a role: a threat for the grant money, a threat for the positions, a threat for my position to explain the world, to be this kind of new priestly case to can explain everything. So I think this is playing a role, and I think it's playing a special role in biology, because if I compare, for example, physics and biology, in physics, the tension is much less, and physicists can talk about maybe information is the ground of everything, and they can think about maybe the universe is a simulation, and which is basically an intelligent design hypothesis. Just the intelligent designer is aliens running a simulation and not some metaphysical being. So physicists are much more open than biologists. And I think one reason is also historical, and that is that most biologists still live in this kind of 19th century paradigm of a clockwork universe where everything runs according to deterministic laws of nature. And they haven't really made this paradigm shift that happened in physics, where people realize, well, the world is not deterministic, and if you look at the smaller and smaller scale, matter breaks down, and you can see everything is just waves of probability and so on. So materialism really is breaking down in physics, and which is the queen of the natural sciences. So I think there are several reasons why you have this tension if you question the mainstream consensus in biology. But generally, as soon as you question mainstream consensus, you're attacked. If this is climate science or anything else, there are certain questions that are not allowed. And this should also always make you skeptical. When questioning certain things is no longer allowed, then maybe this field feels threatened by the questions.
I read your article, Matthew, regarding Thomas Huxley, and I want you to explain it in about 3 minutes, the background and what was your research. And you know, it sort of clarifies how different platforms are influenced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Well, this came out of my research on the Untold History of Canada series of books that sort of situate Canada within a broader geopolitical history from 1774 all the way to the present. And it focused on a certain period of potential around the time of Abraham Lincoln's victory over the Confederate South in 1865, which when you look at it politically, that wasn't the way a lot of the popular books tell it, but rather you had a lot of British intelligence operations that were supporting the South, French intelligence as well. The world was mostly empire. And Abraham Lincoln had revived a certain system of political economy with his, he had a lot of collaborators. And I read a book by one of them, Henry C. Carey, on the unity of law, the unification of economic, moral, and science. And it really targeted John Stuart Mill, Bentham, Darwin, Malthus, those four in this book. And it basically was justifying what Lincoln was doing in terms of creating a political economy where money wasn't the master, but was merely a servant for the general welfare. So the investments into developing full spectrum economies, it was called the National System of Political Economy. This was also being adopted after the Civil War by followers in Germany that created that created the Zollverein in Germany to unify Germany, to create an industrial integrated nation that wouldn't be susceptible to foreign manipulation of a maritime sea power. Russia, Tsar Alexander II began applying this as well in Russia and Japan and beyond. So this was becoming the basis of a multipolar alliance that people like Ulysses S. Grant were fighting for, and many others, to expand this and help every nation of the world break free of the British unipolar system of empire and develop economies that could stand on their own 2 feet. Now, this is 1865. This is also the same year where the British Empire is going down. They've orchestrated opium wars in Crimea to destroy their enemies. They've expanded themselves very thin, trying to put down Indian uprisings because they, as part of their Malthusian agenda, had to keep populations of the world under control through the use of famine, war, and other things as a part of empire, just as a necessity.
Thomas Huxley.
Yeah, so Thomas Huxley becomes a young, creative person with a lot of wit who's discovered early on by patrons, and he has skills that they don't have in the higher sort of lazy upper management of the empire. And they start recruiting him and giving him more authority quickly. And Huxley begins organizing these debates, always pitting some creationist Anglican fanatic with himself, usually defending Darwin, and publicizing them. And in the course of doing this, he creates two things: a think tank called the X Club in 1865 to sort of help reorganize the empire by bringing together leading scientists of every single field: biology, chemistry, geology, astrophysics, who had a sort of misanthropic worldview. John Tyndall, Herbert Spencer becomes a member of this. Matthew Arnold in education becomes a member of this think tank. And out of this, they create Nature magazine to help advance through a propaganda mechanism, the Darwinian view, to get rid of all other theories that were prevalent at the time by people who were answering the obvious evidence of evolution, but through like we had people like Lamarck, Cuvier, Karl-Ernst von Baer, James Dwight Dana. Many scientists of the 19th century were answering it by recognizing the directionality, the creative leaps that were inherent in both nature and also of the human mind. And they wanted to just get rid of these guys and only have this fake debate. So this is where Thomas Huxley comes in, and he creates a completely new approach that becomes a defining, governing doctrine of the empire as it reorganizes itself at the end of the 19th century and into the creation of the 20th century of war. And I mean, that's a whole other story that I write about a lot. But anyway, that's where I got at that.
And Nature magazine? Nature
magazine is 1869. It was created by the X Club, yeah. They call themselves that. I'm not giving them that name.
Now, I want to ask a question to Dr. Gunter because this is his domain. Dr. Gunter, many Islamic philosophers accuse Darwin of plagiarism in Darwin's book, The Origin of Species. Okay, why do they say that? This book, The Muqaddimah by Ibn Khaldun. He is a Muslim philosopher and scientist. Now, in this book, Ibn Khaldun asserts that human beings developed from the world of monkeys in a process by which species become more numerous. In chapter 1 of the Muqaddimah, he also states that one should then take a look at the world of creation. It started out from the minerals and progressed in an indigenous gradual manner to plants and animals. Now, natural selection and all those things I just summarized what he said. Now, did Darwin in any way claim in his book or even gave reference that there were other philosophers or scientists that are of the opinion or anything? Did he give any reference in his book? It's just a question.
So certainly not to this book, which actually I also didn't know, and I would suspect that Darwin wasn't aware of this book from the Islamic philosopher. What is important to understand, I think, is that it wasn't like Darwin was coming around and before everybody believed in 7-day creationism, and then Darwin brought this view of evolution and common ancestry. Most intellectuals at the time of Darwin were already considering some kind of natural development. This idea goes back to the ancient Greeks already. And there are some of the precursors of thought. Among them, of course, was Lamarck, but also Darwin's own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. So Darwin's quoted some intellectual forerunners which influenced his thought. I think the real crucial part in Darwin, that is also the crucial part that I'm critical of, is not the question of common ancestry. I think there is substantial evidence in favor of common ancestry. But the crucial thing that he innovated together with, not together, but parallel to Wallace, is this idea of a mechanistic process of random variation and then this filter process of natural or sexual selection. And that is the crucial thing. And if this mechanism fails, then Darwinism is wrong, even if common ancestry is correct. So I think it would go too far to accuse Darwin of plagiarism. Of course, there were different accusals of this kind also concerning the work of Wallace, which was sent to the Royal Institution for review, and Darwin could read it, and then of course saw somebody else is working on a similar subject, so I should speed up my own publication. There are some concerns, but it looks like Wallace himself didn't have the feeling that Darwin took advantage of the situation. Yeah. So both went along quite well together and agreed that they parallel developed the same idea, which was kind of in the air at this time. Also related to the social situation where you had this kind of the so-called developed nations apparently outperforming the third world nation and so on. There was this worldview fitted very well with this Darwinist picture, and also was the fertile ground to develop these ideas and later to further develop it into social Darwinism. And I think to refer to the article of Matthew, what I find interesting is that at the same time, at the late 19th century, you also have this kind of idea, which is basically a modern invention and is not true at all, of this conflict between science and religion. There's this famous book by William Draper from 1874, The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. And this worldview was really pushed at this time that there is a conflict between religious belief and scientific evidence. And of course, this was also pushed in these debates that were run by Huxley to paint the religious side as the dumb fools and the scientists as the educated, illuminated, rational part of humanity. And you still find this in people like Richard Dawkins, who say everybody who doubts Darwin must be either dumb or crazy or malevolent. It's still this case that people try to paint a kind of division there that never actually existed before. Even this example of Galileo is more a myth than reality, and Galileo was more criticized because he much overestimated the evidence for his theory. At the time he was right, but the evidence he had was very bad, and that was rightly criticized. And and he was punished because he had very how would you call it, stubborn behavior, very aggressive, even against the Pope, who was in favor of him and really also financed part of his research. So it's not really true that Galileo was kind of discriminated by the church because he said that the cosmology is wrong. He was discriminated for other reasons, and maybe rightly in some, at least in some regards. So there's.
But I was, and you're right, and I'm glad you gave us that information. I had no idea, but I was just trying to relate the right now, like the persecution at the moment with what.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if we call it persecution, but at least the isolation that they put, comparing it with Galileo's thing. Anybody who has a new idea is just somehow silenced, and
I think there are certainly new ideas. The question is, as soon as these new ideas threaten a certain paradigm, which is this ruling paradigm of materialism, also wedded with atheism, but basically materialism and naturalism, which is a kind of unnatural marriage between science and a metaphysical worldview, which is totally unnecessary. And I think it's very unfortunate because it restricts research and it basically puts handcuffs to scientists, how they may think and which kind of explanations they may invoke, even if the evidence would lean to a side they would prefer. They are not allowed to use this. So I think this is kind of a crazy development, but it happened. And as soon as you question this paradigm, this materialist paradigm, then you get this kind of pushback and you get ostracized from the scientific community, and you're a nut job and a crackpot and so on. So
Dr. Gunter,
I think that is the crucial point.
I want you to explain to us, Dr. Gunter, what is intelligent design? We want to hear it from the scientist's mouth. And also, we want you to identify the places where you disagree with Charles Darwin.
So intelligent design basically is an empirical method. It has nothing to do with religion, even if the critics still will say this is an empirical method that is totally uncontroversial in a lot of fields. So in SETI research, you use a certain method to distinguish natural radio signals from potential signals from an alien civilization. In archaeology, you use a certain method to distinguish natural marks on a cave wall from man-made scratch marks or artistry. Or in forensics, you use certain criteria to distinguish a natural death from a murder case, a homicide case. And the same method is applicable also in the natural sciences. You can look, is there evidence that is not possible to be explained by chance or natural law or combination of thereof, which is best explained by intelligence, or at least by information coming from outside of the system. And that is the method that is suggested by intelligent design theory, to use this combination of a certain level of unlikeliness, of being unlikely compared to the available probabilistic resources, and independent an independent pattern, matching an independent pattern. So easy example, if you walk along the beach, any pattern of sand grains, of arrangement of sand grains, has the same unlikelihood or likelihood, whatever the pattern is. But if you find a heart-shaped engraving and there is John loves Mary, you will not think that this was the work of waves and wind, but you will immediately recognize it was an intelligent action, because it's not only unlikely like any pattern of sand grains, but it has this independent pattern that is matching the natural language content. So that is the method of intelligent design. And then you can use this for a research program to look, do we find phenomena in nature that meet these criteria and that are best explained by the action of an intelligent agent? And that is intelligent design theory. Intelligent design cannot identify the agent. And that is not cowardry, that people don't want to admit that they believe it's the Christian God or the Muslim God or whatever. It's simply, that's not in the realm of the applicability of the theory. The theory can show there is evidence for intelligent design, but not who was the designer, what was the motivation of the designer, what was the method of designing. That are questions that transgress the intelligent design method, and that require then different methods, or even metaphysics or religion or whatever.
And that is, and you've beautifully said this, and that is exactly what is practiced in forensics. 100% correct. When you're at a crime scene and you're trying to get some, and the similar thing, Matthew, we're doing on Mars and other planets. This is exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to find some sort of a sign of an alien life, or some sort of a sign so we can, but when it comes to God, there is a problem. But if it's aliens, it's fine. I mean, it's just, it's biasness from the materialist or atheist lot. Dr. Gunter, last question, and then we get to Matthew. Which points do you disagree with Darwin?
Basically, the mechanism. So the question is not, is the mechanism wrong? Of course, natural selection and random variation works on a certain level, maybe on the level of speciation, that you have one founder finch species on Galapagos differentiating into different finches. But the question is there a limit to the mechanism? And I think there is very good evidence, theoretical evidence, mathematical evidence, but also empirical evidence, for example, from the fossil record, that this process cannot explain the major transitions in the history of life. How did multicellular animal life come into being? How did certain complex organs come into being? The eye, the brain, the bird feather, the placenta in mammals, and all this kind of stuff cannot be explained, in my view, with this process of random copy errors and natural selection. No computer engineer would claim that you could transform Windows XP into Mac OS by randomly changing some bits in the code. The only thing that you will do is break the code before you can even reach some minor new function. And I think this mechanism is the crucial thing that fails to explain the real phenomena. And that is not just said by intelligent design proponents. There are a lot of mainstream theoretical biologists who acknowledge, and meanwhile openly acknowledge, that neo-Darwinism, and neo-Darwinism is just the term, or the modern synthesis is a synonym, the term for this process of random variation, natural selection, that this mechanism cannot explain new organs, phenotypic complexity, and novel structures, and these non-gradual transitions in the history of life. This is meanwhile recognized by most of the theoretical biologists that work on this field, and they are like crazy looking for new paradigms. And there are all these catchwords like niche construction and phenotypic plasticity and evo-devo and so on, where they try to find a new mechanism that could fill this gap that is left by the explanatory deficits of Darwinism. But there has nothing come up yet. And I think the interesting time will start maybe in 10 years, when all these different approaches have failed as well, and people will start to face the fact that there has to be a fundamental paradigm change to really explain the complexity of life.
Well said.
Well said. Well said. Matthew, getting to Darwinism, I was going through a book on social Darwinism, and seriously, when I finished that book, it was pretty creepy. I want you to give your thoughts on social Darwinism. I mean, I was once with a scientist, right? Mm. And we were having our discussion. We were talking, and he agrees with biological evolution. He's a materialist scientist. And all of a sudden, I asked him a question. I'm like, did you ever go through the social Darwinism theory? And he's like, that doesn't mean it isn't true. Mm. That doesn't make it untrue, right? Just because it's creepy doesn't make it untrue. But well, how do you approach social Darwinism? Your comments on that?
Yeah, you kind of, I think, have to do it in a tactful way, with a bit of mockery, or at least showcase a little bit of the absurdity of it through your own. Like for example, 2006, Richard Dawkins writes in an article where he defends eugenics, and he says, sure, Hitler did a lot of bad things, but there's a lot of scientific evidence behind the science of eugenics that people are afraid to look at. And just because having a bigger claw or height is hereditary, why would we assume that aptitude for music or mathematics isn't also hereditary? And couldn't we use this knowledge? Just throwing it out there. And I mean, that's horrific if you really, really get into it. And this is the guy who said every single idea of mankind that existed before 1859 should be scrapped and treated like crap in his Selfish Gene introduction. So, you have this uncomfortable reality that, and Ben Stein in his Expelled did get at that nicely in a scary, creepy way, that the same ideas of eugenics that gave birth and rise to fascism in the 1920s and 30s simply changed its costume, and we find it still infusing itself in a lot of fields of science. It's uncomfortable to look at. Almost anywhere you look, there's residues, strong ones, of the carryover. But I think social Darwinism, like a lot of people say, oh, it wasn't Darwin's fault. He didn't want to apply this to human society. That was Spencer. And it's like, well, I read The Descent of Man from 1872, and in it, Darwin directly says that only the foolest of species would allow the weakest and dumbest of their species to breed and reproduce. Now, he then says in the next paragraph, but we're moral creatures, and we will keep our weak alive because we're moral. So he's basically saying that he, as a moral being, doesn't like the social consequences of his theory of the universe, of nature at least. But it doesn't mean that that it doesn't apply. Like Herbert Spencer was just honest about it. He was like, no, let's not lie to ourselves. if we want to act according to natural law, let's just be serious. And Galton took it even further into a genetic world. But this existed before even Darwin. Like there was social Darwinism. I always make this point. Before there was Darwin, Darwin admits in his autobiography that he got his idea in 1838 when he was on the Beagle by reading Malthus's Essays on Population. And he says, oh, then I had a theory by which to work. And who was Malthus? I mean, he passed himself off as a priestly man, a pastor, but he worked for the British East India Company teaching economics. And he was, I mean, you could read in his editions of this essay that was super influential that that because human populations always reproduce geometrically and resources in agriculture arithmetically, that at some forecastable future point, so when you linearly do an extrapolation into the future, there will be a breaking point crisis, which it's the role of the governance of the political governance to manage the population through what the tools nature gave us. And Malthus is very clear that famine, war, disease are the tools that we have to use as the dismal science. And the fact that, I mean, Darwin got these ideas and says so from Malthus. This was, and Malthus got these ideas. They were the British Empire that he worked for was doing this anyway. It was just called Hobbesianism, and he gave it more of a, I guess you could say, a scientific veneer, which was made even more, I guess, adaptive to the realities of the day under Darwin and Huxley. But really, I mean, this is a system which goes beyond, as far back as we look in history, we could see evidence of empires needing to justify their existence through some scientific veneer to manage populations and keep people from actualizing their creative potential, which always disrupts. It's a disrupting influence to empire that wants to monopolize everything and keep things static. They see disequilibrium as an evil that has to be crushed. So that's one of those things that I think people have to look at in science as well as in politics and history.
Dr. Gunter, as a scientist, but a scientist who abides by the intelligent design worldview, I've always wondered this question. How open is the intelligent design worldview towards aliens or extraterrestrial life? How do they look at it?
I think there is no position of the ID movement to this, because that's a question that is, let's say, orthogonal to
your personal. Your personal.
My personal opinion is that it's very unlikely, because I think that the question that life originates naturally is extremely unlikely, so unlikely that some scientists like Eugene Koonin, meanwhile, even invoke infinite multiverse to explain the origin of life, because the probabilistic resources of our universe wouldn't be sufficient to explain life even on Earth. So having life on different planets, I think, would be rather an argument for, if we find it, rather an argument for intelligent design and for multiple creation on different planets, because it would be even more absurd to believe that this came into being by a natural process multiple times in the same universe. So I would be skeptical. I think we are alone in the universe on our planet, at least alone as an intelligent species. One thing to the social Darwinist question, strangely, I think I can defend Richard Dawkins in a way, because he also said that he is only a Darwinist in terms of biology, but when it comes to human society, he is an anti-Darwinist and he doesn't want to have Darwinism. But the dangerous thing, I think, is that there's no reason why he should have this position. If Darwinism is correct, and especially if you combine Darwinism with materialism and atheism, there is no really logical reason why you should have moral restraints to extinguish the weak and to have a Nietzschean view of human society. This worldview doesn't have the philosophical resources to have some kind of human rights or human dignity. We are just bags of carbon and water and elementary particles doing their thing. So I think even though Dawkins can be applauded that he has this moral position, and I think he's a quite decent human being in terms of his moral position, but I think it is inconsistent with his worldview. And if his worldview is really consistently applied, then the social Darwinism of the 19th century will be really peanuts. And we see it in a lot of philosophers who now push this view that free will is an illusion, your self is an illusion, you don't even really exist, there is no objective moral values, and so on. So this will be a deconstruction of everything that makes us human, and ultimately say we are nothing but robots, which is also something that Dawkins and Daniel Dennett affirm, that we are kind of wet biological robots and nothing else. And this, of course, if everybody would really believe this and would really act consistently to this belief, would be an absolute nightmare for society. So I think beyond the scientific question, there is certainly the social question that this is a worldview that potentially has very dangerous consequences.
I mean, if we ask them about morality, they start injecting us with Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape,
Yes.
right? Where he tries to argue that science gives us morality. And I read that book. That was extremely flawed.
Because he starts from the assumption, if we want to have well-being, then we should do, but that is not a categorical imperative. It's just this condition that he presupposes that human beings or conscious beings should flourish. Why? I think cabbage should flourish, or sand, or whatever. So he doesn't really explain where this value of flourishing of conscious beings comes from. But when you assume that the flourishing of conscious beings should be maximized, then of course you can derive certain imperatives from it, but that's hardly a fundamental insight.
I would just say, can I say something to this?
Yeah, sure, you can add.
Okay, yeah, I was just thinking about the categorical imperative idea and trying to scientifically explain away the existence of certain immaterial things like love, or agapic love, the higher order of love that you see so brilliantly animating the hearts of great people like Martin Luther King. When you read Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches, or I mean Abraham Lincoln, you just read the speeches of some of these sublime souls, and they really did love themselves. They cared about the health of their own soul. They loved their fellow human beings, and they loved humanity as a idea, and they loved their idea of God, that they had a direct relationship, and this all shaped their identities and their choices and their insight that were creative. They had an ability to tap into a certain creative source that people didn't understand in their own lifetimes, but it was powerful. And I think when you try to say, oh, I've had biologists explain to me that, oh yeah, Martin Luther King actually there's no love. It's enlightened self-interest. That's all it is. And they try to reduce it all to some genetic sort of explanation. But I mean, you're ignoring something which is discoverable if you look for it, and you're cutting yourself off from your own access to it inside of yourself, which is why I think Friedrich Schiller wrote of Kant. He was horrified that Kant had developed his categorical imperatives, because Schiller said, no, we have love, we have free will, and no man to be truly free must. We must be the creature that develops our desires in conformity with our reason as a mature species, so that we desire what we should do. We shouldn't always feel some conflict with ourselves, the way you have in the Kantian system. So yeah, I would just throw that. And that also influenced Humboldt, Alexander von Humboldt, Wilhelm, who were big influences in creating a whole social scientific movement that had big influences in America with James Dwight Dana and a lot of the scientists who were looking at evolution and looking for these higher qualities in nature. It's very clear.
Dr. Gunter, I mean, I've always wanted to ask you this question, because I was reading your biography and it said that you are a fossil expert. Am I correct?
I hope I'm not a fossil expert, but I'm an expert on fossils.
Yes, that's what I meant. That's what I meant. My question is that why does the theory of evolution lack fossil record? I've always wondered this. Like, if we can actually find dinosaurs Why can't we find those fossils that are missing?
Yeah, I think it depends how you define evolution. If you define evolution just as common ancestry and you look at the fossil record, then you have evidence. Then you find there is a certain order in the fossil record. It's not chaotic. You find more simple forms of life in the lower and older layers and more developed forms of life in the higher and younger layers. The younger the layers are, the more similar they are to the modern flora and fauna. So there's some evidence that is arguably best explained by this hypothesis of common ancestry. But still, I think it should be allowed to also mention some conflicting evidence. But generally, I would affirm this. So where the fossil record really disagrees with Darwin is there is a very much integral part of Darwin's theory is gradualism. And it's not for nothing that Darwin mentioned 6 times in his book the Latin sentence, natura non facit saltum, nature doesn't make jumps, because he was very aware that as soon as you allow for saltations, then you cannot longer explain this process naturalistically. Then you have to invoke something like miracles or to explain these very, very unlikely saltations. So he wanted to have a very much gradual process. And that's still true today. Richard Dawkins has this metaphor of climbing mountain improbable. You cannot jump up the steep cliff, but you can slowly walk on the backside of the mountain where there's a gentle slope, and step by step you can climb mountain improbable. But the fossil record shows that consistently over all periods of Earth history in all different groups of organisms, the fossil record is discontinuous, and new body plans appear suddenly. And suddenly, not only in terms of, let's say, geological periods of time, but suddenly really in the sense that within the lifetime of 1 or 2 successive species, you have a transformation, let's say, from a pig-like artiodactyl ancestor into a fully marine whale. This kind of re-engineering within the lifespan of 1 or 2 successive species is simply impossible by the Darwinian process, which would require thousands of minor variations adding up to each other. So I think this is really empirical falsification of the theory. And usually when your theory conflicts with the empirical data, you question your theory and redesign the theory. But what sometimes happens or often happens with Darwinism is that either the data are questions or the data are reinterpreted into the theory. And the theory says, well, we predicted this all along. If first theory predicts gradualism, but suddenly the theory is reformulated in a way that say, oh, it can also predict non-gradual transitions. So then you have something that is really protecting itself against falsification, and you get some kind of system that is more similar to psychoanalysis or other fields of pseudoscience that are non-falsifiable. Mm. So I think that is the real problem between Darwinism and the fossil record.
We're gonna talk for another five more minutes.
Can I ask a follow? Can I ask a question to the doctor?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure. I'm
sorry if I was going to steal this question from you. I don't know if this entered your mind too, Zain. What do you think would be a more fruitful mechanism to look for to account for the empirical evidence in the fossil records? Is it something astrophysical, or what would be the better, more fruitful line of investigation you would recommend?
That's already happening. So for a while, all kind of catastrophism was shunned by evolutionary biology. Meanwhile, catastrophism is very much incorporated into the theory. You have all these events, meteor extinguish the larger dinosaurs and so on. You have these mass extinction events that are explained with catastrophes. But I think this doesn't explain the really abrupt appearances of new body plans, new complex structures, new types of organisms. And I think there you need some kind of saltational mechanism that, in my view, requires some influx, at least influx of information. And there is a lot of difference between intelligent design proponents. A lot of them will invoke this kind of divine design. I rather think in a more indirect way, and could imagine that it's some kind of quantum computation, that you have entangled DNA, and if you have these different branches of the wave function, then certain branches are more likely than others. And then you have some also some intelligent input, but on another level. That would be, the intelligent would be on the level of the structure of the wave function, for example. But I think it would go too far to go into the details. But there are different approaches by different intelligent design proponents how you could explain these phenomena. But I think the crucial thing is that you must allow for some kind of non-gradual saltational mechanism, saltational events to really do justice to the empirical data and not trying to explain them away. As many scientists try and say, well, there was no Cambrian explosion, and it was really gradual, and we only didn't find the fossils for this or that reason. But if you really look at all those cases, you find that the data are quite clear, and the statistical support is so good that we have good evidence that this is not an artifact of undersampling. We haven't looked enough, but is really something that nature wants to tell us. Then we should draw our conclusions and formulate new hypotheses.
Dr. Gunter, when I look at the Discovery Institute, I look at books of Stephen C. Meyer, Signature in a Cell. I look at works of Dr. Bechly. I look at your work and your books. I want you to summarize some major points where you can advocate intelligent design.
I think different points. I think on the level of the universe, certainly the question, why is there anything rather than nothing? Why do we have this fine tuning of the universe, of the laws of nature, of the physical constants? That is something that can either be explained by some kind of metaphysical being outside of space and time as explanation, or by the multiverse hypothesis. And there are other problems with the multiverse hypothesis why I don't believe in this option. Basically, it makes any kind of rational discourse impossible, because in an infinite multiverse, everything that can happen happens in an infinite number of time. And then you cannot distinguish between likely and unlikely events anymore.
Right.
So that is one point. I think on the level of the origin of life, there's certainly intelligent design needed, because the whole field of of origin of life research basically failed to find any convincing hypothesis how the first living cell originated. I think on the level of the major transitions in the history of life itself, how certain structures came into being, how certain body plans come into being, there have to be design explanations, which doesn't mean that on the lower levels there can't be design explanations, but there we don't have the, let's say, the method doesn't deliver the evidence with a statistically sufficient reliable signal. So we have it for the larger transitions. If there's also intelligent design for the minor transitions, we don't know it, possible or not. And then I think certainly on the level of origin of consciousness, which is not for nothing called by David Chalmers, philosopher of mind, the hard problem of consciousness, because I think it is in principle impossible to explain this with a materialistic, mechanistic explanation, because you can't explain a first-person phenomenon from a third-person view. This cannot work in principle. And finally, the question, morality, are there objective moral values, something? I think there can be no Darwinist explanation for this. Every Darwinist explanation will ultimately boil down to something like, I scratch your back, you scratch my back, and reciprocal services and so on, but not really what we mean by self-sacrificial love and acts like that. So I think these are the different levels where intelligent design plays a role. Also on this question, habitable zone of the planet, the interaction of the different chemics. There have been recent books, wonderful books by Michael Denton on this fine-tuning on the level of oxygen, of water, which all have to play together to allow not only life, but intelligent life that can discover the universe and ask fundamental questions. So I think there are multiple levels where the evidence clearly cries out for a design explanation and for real teleology in nature. Also that you have this overall pattern of development in the history of life from simple to complex and from more and more independent from the habitats and the biotopes, and having more intelligence, more mental capacities. Of course, it's just average, and there are showcases for different trends, but on the average, I think there's a clear trend where you can see this is a directional development and not a chaotic development as it would be predicted by Darwin.
Matthew, I want to get to the last question with you. We look at arguments against the intelligent design theory, and that argument is very spread out, but I want to rephrase it. Materialists are like, look at the human being's jaw. Look, it's so imperfect, and look at the eyes. We could have made them better, and look at the forehead. It should have been shorter or bigger. I mean, we're not advocating perfect design. We're advocating intelligent design, and there's a difference between perfection and intelligence. What do you say about that, Matthew?
Between perfection and intelligence?
We're just saying, how do you see this argument? I mean, I've seen many atheist philosophers criticizing how human beings are made. Look at the nose, look at the eyes. It should have been better. This could have been better. And what I'm saying is that intelligent design never argues a perfect design. It says an intelligent design.
Okay, yeah, I think that it's really valuable to look at some things like these very important debates. And here I'm not referring to the Huxley versus Anglican creationist debates, but rather if you go back a little bit further and look at the Leibniz-Clark correspondence, where Clark, just like Huxley was sort of the controller and representative of Darwin as his bulldog, Clark was the bulldog for Newton. Newton, just like Huxley, couldn't be trusted to defend their own theories in public when you had a real a competent scientist debate them. And Leibniz was a very competent scientist. And his work on dynamics, on the continuum, on vis viva were very, very important. And I think have great relevance to the anti-Darwinian approach to even evolution today. But Leibniz is famously mocked for having said, this is the best of all possible worlds. People say, oh, but obviously we can imagine a world that's better. And you have Voltaire and Candide making fun of like this poor guy who's just super naive and gullible, saying, "Oh, it's the best of all possible worlds," but is like he loses his legs, his loved ones die, and Voltaire's a cynic and he wants you to just basically recuperate from your naive optimism in humanity that you might have gotten by reading Leibniz. Leibniz actually did make discoveries of the infinitesimal calculus. He actually made breakthroughs in like paradigm shifting breakthroughs in almost every branch of knowledge, really, in linguistics and history and in science, you name it. So he wasn't just anybody. And he makes the point, no, I don't, in this debate with Clark, I'm not saying it's the best of all possible universe because it's just, it can't get any better. It's because it can always get better that it's the best of all possible universe. Because if God made the universe in a perfect way that couldn't be made better, then that puts a big limitation on our idea of what God can do himself. God would be inhibited from making things better, which makes him not much of a god. It makes the world kind of bad. We'd all be robots, being perfect. So it's because we have that ability to willfully make things better, to change our circumstances, that is a living evidence that we live in the best of all possible worlds. So it's never perfect, because if it were, it would be very imperfect. But the fact that it's able to direct in a directionality, move in a certain self-perfectibility when it comes to mankind. We see that we had that there in nature anyway before humankind and self-conscious reasoning. It was already, we see evidence of this natural flow, but with human beings, we can accelerate that to the point that we can create elements on the periodic table, like the transuranics, that we didn't find in nature, because we were able to make breakthroughs in the geometry of the atom and then apply it to make life better for our future posterity. So all of that is, I think, really contained in Leibniz's worldview. And if they read those Leibniz-Clark correspondences, I mean, you can see the contrast of the mechanistic view of the universe, represented by this this clock that's just winding away and losing its potential for change in the Darwinian system, versus the Leibnizian system of a self-developing universe based on certain specific reasons. So I think that, yeah, people just need to have access to these things in their education system and work them through on their own, which we don't have under our current world, unfortunately. I think that has to change in the new paradigm of science that's ahead of us.
Last question.
Maybe I could add one point concerning this question of malfunctioning design, of alleged bad design. And that is, of course, always a little bit naive to imagine that you could improve one special thing without changing the rest. But every engineer knows that you have to make trade-offs. And of course, you could make a cheetah running 1,000 kilometers per hour, but then its heart would have to be bigger than the whole animal, and it would outrun all of its prey and would be extinct in a few months. So these trade-offs often explain alleged bad design, because the bad design is not so bad if you look at the whole picture and not only at an isolated structure.
That's good. And that is Leibniz right there, because Leibniz was saying you may not know anything absolutely in its perfect absolute sense, but you can get at this through what he calls analysis situs, or the geometry of position by triangulation from a variety of perspectives. You can zero in on your thought concept that is the solution to a problem, but you can never know it in that sort of naive absolute way that Bertrand Russell refutes in his works. Or, you know, so yeah, what you're just saying there is key. You have to look at the whole system as one dynamic process rather than try to look at things bottom up from like one part to another part. You know, exactly. And then you get the three-body problem.
And even though if a design is flawed, that doesn't make it unintelligent. It's still intelligent.
No,
it's just not perfect.
A bad car is a designed car and not a non-designed car.
My last question to Dr. Gunter is that do you see intelligent design being taught in universities in the near future?
No.
And the last second,
I think first it would be too much optimistic to think that it could be taught, let's say, on the scale of the next years, because that is not the way science works. So it will be taught in school or at university as soon as it reaches a certain threshold where it is accepted by other scientists, by mainstream scientists. And of course, currently it doesn't look like this is happening too fast because there are these worldview barriers. I think this will happen rather on a midterm scale of 20, 30 years. And I think the change will come rather from physics, when physics really has shown that materialism fails and that the fundamental building block of nature is not matter, but information and so on. I think if this really also gets into the minds of biologists, then they will be more open to other approaches. And when all these extended synthesis stuff has failed, then they will also be more open to a paradigm shift. So I think it will take longer. Ultimately, I think truth will prevail. And I'm very much convinced that intelligent design has a valid point and is correct. But I think it would be naive to think that it will happen on a level of 5 or 10 years. That's not how science works, especially in these loaded issues like materialism and evolution.
Dr. Gunter, just a few minutes and then we wrap this up. If there is one argument which you think is strong against the argument of intelligent design, the theory of intelligence, which argument would you say comes close to that?
I think the best and the only possible alternative is really this multiverse approach, not only on the level of the cosmological phenomena, but also on the level of origin of life and later events in the history of life. Even for these major transitions, the multiverse has already been invoked by scientists in publications. So I think this is the major alternative to invoke this kind of infinite options of infinite alternative universes where everything happens and then, hey, here we are, because if we wouldn't be here, we couldn't ask the question. So this kind of anthropic reasoning. And I think it's the most important thing to do for intelligent design proponents and is to show that this hypothesis is flawed. And it definitely is flawed. And that is realized, for example, in cosmology by the so-called measure problem, which is the problem how to partition infinity and still arrive at finite probabilities. And that has been realized, for example, by cosmologists like Max Tegmark as the biggest crisis in cosmology, because on the one hand, they have to postulate this kind of infinite multiverse. And on the other hand, it totally makes quantum mechanics obsolete, because in quantum mechanics, it's built on finite probabilities. And in the multiverse, or also if you invoke the many worlds interpretation in quantum mechanics, everything happens with the probability of 1. So I think if you can refute the multiverse, then intelligent design will be the last man standing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gunter Bechly, for being on Zain Khan Live. It was a pleasure having you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Matthew Ehret, for being on Zain Khan Live. It's always a pleasure having you.
It was a pleasure to be on, and thank you, Dr. Bechly. That was really, really enriching.